Now we get into the talk story part of the evening, where we talk about Hawaiian culture, history, legend, language, healing, shamanism, and the philosophy that we call Huna, based on 7 ideas about life. That the world is what you think it is, there are no limits, energy flows where attention goes, now is the moment of power, to love is to be happy with, all power comes from within, and effectiveness is the measure of truth. And we talk about all these things in the way that I was brought up in this knowledge, and that's by question and answer. Now your questions take us on a different journey every time we meet, but someone has already asked a question, and I'm going to answer that one first. Because the question was, what did the Hawaiians eat? You know, in old Hawaii. And I realized that there's a lot of things not known, but there's a lot of things that are kind of misconstrued or misinterpreted or just plain wrong. So I want to straighten some things out, maybe give you some new information, and give a little kind of a demonstration of what the Hawaiians ate in the old days, before Captain Cook. Okay? First of all, I'll tell you what they did not eat. Okay? Because there's some misunderstanding. They did not eat papayas. There weren't any papayas before Captain Cook. They did not eat mangoes. Didn't have mangoes here. Okay? Didn't have avocados. None of those either. And they certainly did not have pineapples. Curiously enough, I know, poor people, you can see this one tells where the pineapples came from, right? Okay, that's Dole. Sometimes people, especially English-speaking people, will give nicknames to people a little bit derogatory sometimes to a certain type of people. For instance, I know the British called the French frogs because they ate frogs, some of them. Not all Frenchmen eat frogs, but some of them did. So all Frenchmen were called frogs. Well, for a while there, all Hawaiians were called pineapples, right? Because that was the association with the islands. But pineapples came from someplace else. Okay? They're not from here. Right. Now, what did they eat? Well, I'll go through the vegetables first. This is the main thing that they ate. This is taro. Right? That's what it looks like when it's pulled out of the ground and the leaves are taken off. This is the thing then that is, first of all, baked, and then skinned, and then mashed, and made into poi. Now it can be eaten and just baked. It cannot be eaten raw. There's a type of crystal in here that spinach has a little bit. This has a lot. And if you try to eat this raw, why, you get all kinds of problems with your mouth and your throat and your intestines, because these crystals can be poisonous. This has to be cooked, and it has to be then peeled, and it can be eaten that way, or it can be made into poi. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the Hawaiians always ate their food cooked. They didn't eat raw fish, for instance. No? They always ate cooked food, and they always ate it cold. Okay? Not hot steaming coming from the oven. It was always cold. So anyway, taro was the most important. They had yams. That's what this is. No one knows where they got them first, but this is one of the staples too. Yams were very important. A very well-loved food was sweet potato. They had sweet potatoes before Captain Cook as well, all throughout Polynesia. Okay. Now the bananas were here when the Polynesians got here. There were people, sometimes called Menehune, sometimes called the Namu or the Nawa, who were already here. And they specialized in bananas. And before Captain Cook, the Hawaiians had 80 different varieties of bananas. 80 of them. Most of those are extinct. We don't know anymore, but we have the names for 80 different types of bananas. Okay. And let's see, sugarcane was here. Hawaiians had sugarcane, right? And they used it for as a sweetener, you know, or just something to chew on for fun, but they also used it for medicine. Okay? And let's see, very important one was coconut. Hawaiians apparently brought the coconut with them. Okay? So this was Hawaiian food and water, okay? And lots of other things. One more thing they had, again, not known where it came from because the scientists say that it originally came from Malaysia or India. It's called, now it looks something like this. This is a mango, but the mountain apple called ohi'ai, which means the ohia that you eat. It's somewhat related to another tree called ohia that you don't eat, but this was the ohi'ai, that's the mountain apple. And it looks something like this. And it has seeds inside, not a lot of them, and the flesh is like a soft apple. Very delicious. They still have these around. Okay? So those are the vegetable things that they ate. Okay? If anybody wants the Hawaiian names for them, I can give them. In addition to that, the Hawaiians had certain kinds of flesh foods, if you like. So I'm going to hold this up and do my best to hold it steady, okay, for the camera. Okay? But on your upper left, that's the one the Hawaiians brought with them, the pig. Pua'a. And that was a very important food. Interesting thing about the pig, though, from one source that I read, they did not, how can I put this? They did not cook it in the imu. They did not cook the pig in the earth oven. They cooked the pig by filling it with hot rocks and then wrapping it with both banana leaves and tea leaves and letting it sit and cook above ground. And then they would go in after a while and cut away the cooked part. Now, first of all, by the way, before they would even do that, they would salt it down. That was their preservation method. So it would be very, very highly salted. Then they would cook it. And after the rocks had cooled down, they would go in and cut away the cooked parts and then put more hot rocks in. And just cooking it away from the inside out. Something like a Hawaiian microwave. Okay? But that way, a big pig could last a very long time. Okay? Now, the other one, the upper right, from your point of view, is called a Poi Dog. Now, the Poi Dog was a special breed of dog that the Hawaiians brought here, and they used it. They were pets, they were companions, and they were food. One missionary wrote about being at a big feast where they cooked 200 dogs for the feast. Sometimes the dog would be given to a child when the child was born, or at least reached the oldest child reached his first birthday, and it would be a companion until it was time to eat it. And there wasn't anything wrong with that. So they would call Poi Dogs because they fed them on poi. It produced a change in the bone structure of the dog. But gradually, as other dogs were brought in, this breed was almost wiped out. Some scientists tried to recreate the breed, but it failed. And so there's a species gone. That kind of dog doesn't exist anymore. Let's see, just below the dog, you have, the Hawaiians ate a lot of fish, always preserved in some way. Like I said, never raw, preserved and cooked. But dried fish and salted fish was very, very popular. And one of the favorites was mullet, which is what these fish are. But they eat almost any kind of fish. Down from that was shrimp, another popular seafood. Down from that was what we call the limpet, which is opihi in Hawaiian, which a lot of Hawaiians still go out on the rocks. And if they're not swept away by big waves, why, they get a very delicious unique kind of food that was much more abundant in the old days than it is now. And let's see, over on the under the pig, the Hawaiians brought jungle fowl with them that they called moa. And they're not exactly chickens, although nowadays what you see is pretty much interbreeding with Western chickens. But some of them still retain a lot of the coloring of the original moa, okay, the original jungle fowl. These things fly. They still fly. They roost in trees, so they're not the same as the domestic chicken. They taste a lot tougher. Down the far below the chicken then is octopus. And really representing all the different kinds of sea creatures that were eaten. Octopus was very popular. And these were the only meats that the Hawaiians ate. Yes?
Did they eat the eggs?
That's a good question, because I researched that. Okay? One of the things I started wondering about, well, what did they do with the eggs? Because they ate not just chickens, they ate all kinds of birds. You know, the plovers that some of you see on your lawns this season, why, they ate those. They ate almost any bird they could catch, which is why about 76 species are extinct, okay, that we know of. At any rate, they ate birds, okay? But did they eat eggs? Now, I researched quite a few sources, and all the ones I researched, when they talk about the foods that Hawaiians ate, I looked at David Malo, Samuel Kamakaua, John Wise, let's see, who else was in there? Peter Buck. And these are all people who wrote quite extensively on the foods that the Hawaiians ate, and not once are eggs mentioned. Not any kind of bird eggs at all. So as far as we know, they didn't eat eggs. Okay? They could have, but no one kept a record. But it's strange that the Hawaiians writing about their own people would never even mention eggs as a food source. Yes?
So the salting, when they salted it down, was that from the ocean?
From the sea salt that they would make, yes.
So they had a way of drying it, of procuring the salt from the ocean?
Oh yeah, we had one big session here on the salt pond and how they did salt. And they would make these special pond areas, quite a process that was done, near the ocean, where they would bring in seawater, or it would be in a place where the seawater was right there, brine it's called, didn't have to dig very far. And then they would transfer this to pools as it evaporated, getting more and more salt each time. And then that was a source of salt. There is famous salt ponds here on Kauai that were used for this, and today they still produce salt, but it cannot be sold. It only can be used by the families and who they give it to. But they cannot be used commercially. There are other places in the islands now that do produce commercial sea salt. Right, but this was all the islands had places where this was done in the old days, because they had to do a lot of meat preservation. Okay.
It's amazing when you try to figure out, how do people know to do that? How did they know that salt would do that? How much trial and error would it take?
Oh, it didn't take a lot, because it was the people who came down from the Pleiades that taught them how to do that. Okay, everybody knows that. All right, so we can take any of those topics, we can follow this up, or any of the other topics I talked about. Any? Yes?
The Huna, breadfruit, was that ever mentioned?
The what?
Breadfruit.
Breadfruit. Thank you for doing that. It's the only one I left out because I didn't have a sample. Okay? Yes, breadfruit was very important in the old days. Breadfruit, I didn't get a sample, but a large ripe breadfruit is about this size, round. It looks like it has pebbles. It's green, but it looks like it has a pebbly surface. It has beautiful leaves that are used in many kinds of decorations and quilt designs and things like that. And the tree was used in a lot of ways. But the breadfruit itself was also baked. And remember, they cooked everything. They may have eaten the mountain apple raw and bananas, very probably. But, and the breadfruit possibly, because when the breadfruit is ripe and you cut it open, it's like a pudding. And it's absolutely delicious. But it's also delicious baked with a lot of butter, fried, yes, breadfruit was also an important source.
Didn't the Hawaiians also have arrowroot?
They had arrowroot, yes. The Hawaiians, they called it pia. And, but this was mostly used as a thickener and not as a main food source except in times of famine. It's very similar when it's scraped and ground. It's very similar to cornstarch in the effect of it. And it's still used today. Well, I don't know if they still use the pia, but they used it to make haupia. which is a combination of the arrowroot, starch, and coconut cream. Now, coconut cream or coconut milk is not the same as coconut water. Coconut water is what you get if you break open the coconut and you got that semi-clear liquid. It's very refreshing. Coconut cream or coconut milk is made when you take the inner part, the white part, and you squeeze the liquid out of that. And that thicker white liquid that comes out of that, very sweet and full of carbs, is the coconut milk or the coconut cream. And that's what was used to make the haupia pudding. Right. Yes?
So will you talk about some of the other kinds of foods they ate during famines? The famine foods?
During famine, sure. Now, during famine, they ate different things, of course, because during famine, they didn't have the water, as was used almost always because of drought. They didn't have the water to be able to grow the regular crops. They did have a type of taro called dryland taro, and didn't need as much water, and they grew that when they could in, some of the upper regions of the canyons. They had a lot of different kinds of ferns. Some of the ferns had tops that they would eat, and some of the ferns had starchy roots that they would eat. The tea plant, the roots of the tea plant were eaten too. They were sometimes eaten as a sweet, but also in famine they were eaten as a famine food. When they were really desperate, the hala plant, which was used for mats. When you see it looks almost like a pineapple, the fruit of it, it has these keys, they're called, that it's made up of. When they get ripe, they fall off, and they kind of difficult to describe what they look like, almost like a fat pine cone piece, okay, like a real thick, fat pine cone piece. And they have a little bit of starch in them. And so they were used as well. Some Hawaiians made them out of leis, made leis out of them rather, the keys, because they were pretty and because they saved people's lives. Other people didn't use them because they were typically presented at funerals and represented death. Okay, so some Hawaiians made leis out of them, some didn't because of those connotations.
Noni also?
Noni was a medicine. Yeah, noni was not a food source. So I've been kind of specializing in food sources tonight. Sometime we'll do medicine. But, so noni was used as a medicine, right? Nobody in their right mind would use it as a food source. Okay? No, the reason I say that, for those of you who don't know, is that when noni gets ripe, it has a very characteristic odor, okay, that is not too pleasant. Okay? In fact, some people would see extremely bad. Okay? But as a medicine, it was very important. Yes?
So their vegetables were very starchy root vegetables.
Oh, sure.
Did they have anything like leafy greens or broccoli or carrots?
Okay. As a major food source, no, but as a kind of a condiment, the tops of the taro leaves, those were used. In fact, the word luau that we know, that we use today to mean the party, is really the tender tops of the young taro. And so those were used as part of their meals, right? Probably, whether they called it that or not, they wouldn't have called it that, but as a vitamin source, as a green source, okay? But not a major food source.
Seaweed.
Seaweed, yes, limu, of all different kinds of limu is the seaweed, and these were used, but again, more like condiments. They even used kukui as a relish for a lot of dishes. Okay? Yes?
The leaves of the sweet potato as well?
The what?
The leaves of the sweet potato?
I don't have any knowledge that has ever pointed to using the leaves of the sweet potato. Okay? That has not been recorded if they did.
If they cooked their food, why
Yes.
did they eat it cold?
If they cooked their food, why did they eat it cold? Well, very practical reason. Because the food was off there cooking. People didn't stay around and tend it. They had to work, which is one reason why they used so many starchy foods. Okay? Because they needed the energy. So when it came time for the meal, the food would have been already cooked. Now then there was the taking it out and the preparing it, and then the serving it, and all of that took time. And so they didn't think anything, they didn't purposely chill it, but it wasn't hot when they ate it, right? And the men were the ones who had to prepare it, which means certain men were responsible for that, and they even had to prepare it and serve it to the women.
Yay.
Is guava here? Or did the Hawaiians bring the guava, or was that?
Guava's new, yeah. I didn't find one before I came tonight, or I'd have shown that one too. Now, guava came in later, right? Yes.
Could you explain about the Taro and how Huna came from that?
Sure. The taro, when it's growing, so important as a food that there are many Hawaiians in their genealogy trace their ancestry to the taro. Okay? And for those people, the first child born of the gods was called Ha'aloa, which means long life. And that was a taro plant. The second child was a human being, also named Ha'aloa. And it was the brother of the taro plant. And so they consider the taro as part, those Hawaiians consider that as part of the ancestry. Now, how do we get, what is ohana? Where does that come in? When the taro grows, it has, like a potato, if it's growing for a while, has these little shoots that come off of it. All right, well, so does the taro. And these little shoots come off of it, and sometimes those are plucked so that the taro will grow bigger. Sometimes the shoots are allowed to grow and they're planted to make new taros. But that little shoot is called oha. Now, oha is also a word in Hawaiian that means to greet joyfully. Okay? And if you add a na to that, na in Hawaiian is very often as a syllable, na in English. Na, when added to many words, turns them into nouns. So that if you add na to oha, you get ohana, and which can be translated as joy thing, or thing in which happy greetings happen. And that's the word for family. Now that's one derivation. There might be some other people who look at the word differently, but there's definitely a relationship there. Okay. All right. Yes?
Did the Hawaiians hunt?
Did they hunt? Well, yes, they did. They hunted birds and they hunted fish, which is really, don't forget, that's a type of hunting. And to show you how much a type of hunting it is, I just want to add this. I have some friends who teach tracking. And tracking is where you learn how to track animals, wild animals. And they told me that they came to Hawaii to learn Hawaiian-style tracking, which was octopus tracking. Diving down and finding the trail of the octopus so you could hunt down the octopus. So there was underwater tracking that the Hawaiians did too. Okay? So that's a type of hunting. And other than that, there wasn't an awful lot to hunt until the pigs went wild. Okay. Now, if the pigs went wild, then there'd be something to hunt, but they also corralled the pigs, and they had their domestic pigs. But as the whole system began to break down, shortly after Cook arrived, then a lot of the animals and things went wild, and the pigs became wild. And so when some of the British people came, what they did was release, some of them brought boars from Europe. The original Hawaiian pigs were pretty small. They were an Asian type pig. But when the English pigs were brought in, and they were allowed to roam free in the forest where they could mate with the other wild local pigs and eventually produce a bigger boar like the type we have today. Yeah. Yes?
Lots of pigs in Europe are pink, and the boars are here all black. Maybe.
Most of the ones here are black. The original boars out in the wilderness, the wild boars of England, were not pink. What we see are domesticated pigs and have very little The pink ones that we see have very little hair. The wild boars, even in Europe, are very hairy. Okay? So there's a big difference there. Yes.
What, do they use the skin? The boar skin?
Now, you know, that's another thing. I have searched through all the sources I know of and cannot find any instance in which they did any sort of tanning of pig hide and used that for anything. I can't find any sources that talk about it at all. They did use shark.
For the drum?
Shark skin they used for drums and sometimes for a type of chest armor plate. But pig hide I can't find any indication of. Yes.
I read a folktale about, I think it was Kamapua'a.
Yes.
Who said he dressed in pigskins.
Well, okay. Kamapua'a, sometimes called the pig god or a demigod, was actually a wild man shamanic figure. In the legends, the original legends, had the ability to become a pig. Okay? So that's a little different. Okay? Hmm?
He was a pig.
Well, he was either a pig who could take human form or a human who could take pig form. There's a lot of... Nobody's quite sure about that one. Right. But the idea of him dressing in pigskin sounds like a Western interpretation. Yeah. As far as I know also, now they skinned birds, but I don't think they used bird skins for anything. I've never found any indication of that either.
Because even nowadays you see sometimes they hang the hide of the boar on a fence.
Well, that's very modern, sure.
Why do they do that?
To dry it out.
And then, but they take the meat. and then
Oh
they-
yeah, well today when you see pig hunters, what they'll often do is they'll take all the meat off, okay, and then sometimes they'll hang the skin out
On a tree.
on a tree or something like that, and they may or may not plan to do something with it. That depends on the particular hunter. Yeah,
So just throw it away basically.
that depends on the hunter. You don't know. Yeah. Yes.
The sharks, that they use the skin of the hunter sharks to eat them too?
Yes, they ate everything from the sea that they could. Now, it's interesting. There were some families and some individuals who had the shark as their guardian spirit. And there were some, because of that, because you can't generalize anything with all Hawaiians, okay? So there were some then who would not eat the animal that was their guardian spirit. And there were some who would eat it to get the mana of the guardian spirit, because the animal was only the animal form of the spirit. Okay? So again, that depended on families and individuals as to how they approached that. But then there were a lot of other people that the shark was just a food source or a drumskin source. They didn't have any special relationship with it. Yes?
Someone was telling me yesterday that the Hawaiians would sometimes eat warriors, other warriors, to get
Are there
their-
warriors? No. That's a good point. The question really is, were the Hawaiians cannibals?
Well,
Sure. And first of all, no. Would a warrior capture a warrior and then eat the warrior to get their mana? No. Okay? What they did when they captured a warrior would be to take away that warrior's mana.
How?
Well, there were a number of ways. Sometimes using them for sacrifice so that mana would go to the gods. Sometimes some chiefs would demean a captured chief by using their bones for fish hooks and their teeth as decorations. And all of this, you see, would be an insult. And by insulting him, you diminish the mana. Now you got to understand what mana is, okay? It's not among the Hawaiians, not some mysterious magical force that resides in the person's flesh that you get it when you eat it. The Hawaiians did not believe that way. I know there are people in the world who did, but that was not a Hawaiian belief. Mana means influence. So how do you take away the influence of a captured chief? by insulting him every way that you can, by denying him power, by putting him in situations, or even his body in situations, feeding his body to the dogs. That would be another way to diminish the mana of the chief. See? So it was, and what it was doing was diminishing the influence. Now,
In their mind.
hey, it's always in everybody's minds. Always. But there was one thing that was done, was a ritual kind of a thing that was done, sometimes by certain priests and by certain chiefs, where they would eat the eye. They would take out the eye of a captured chief and eat the eye. Okay? And that was under a very special ritual. Okay? And not all of them did it, and they didn't do it all the time. But now that did have to do with mana. Okay? But so that was done on occasion. But that was only individuals. It was never a practice for eating human flesh.
An eye of a live person? Or
What's that?
They kill the person first? Or?
Not always.
And why eye?
It's hard to say what the person had in mind. The word for eye is maka. And maka means to begin, to start something. And it also means for something to appear. Okay? Maybe they were trying to keep something from starting by taking away the eye. Whatever they had in their mind was the reason for doing it. And that could change according to the situation. It's just like the petroglyphs, okay? Nobody knows exactly what any of them mean because the meaning was in the mind of the person who carved them. Okay? So they could, one petroglyph could have many, many meanings. And the specific meaning would depend on the carver. So the specific reason for that eye ritual would depend on the person doing it.
But didn't they eat cook's liver or something? Captain Cook?
There's different stories about that. What we do know is that that was not a general practice. What they did do, which was typical, and which was a way to honor people, was to, it's called rendering the bones, which means boiling away the flesh. And then the flesh of a chief was then taken away and buried so the dogs wouldn't get at it. Okay? And then they would keep the bones and sometimes even polish the bones. And if it was a chief that they wanted to respect, they would wrap the bones and keep them. As far as cook goes, no one really knows what they did with the flesh. But eating the inner parts of the human body was not a practice that was openly followed by anybody in Hawaii. One of the things they did do with the bones was part of the bones they brought back to the ship and said, here, when's he coming again? Okay.
Did he die of natural causes?
What's that?
Did Cook die?
Captain Cook.
They killed him?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that was while he almost, in a way, got himself killed. But technically, yes, he was killed by Hawaiians. Yes, during a big misunderstanding.